Thank you very much. My name is Ed Behrens. I'm the editor of Apollo magazine. And I am delighted to be joined in this conversation about archives with Andrea Bacchi, who is the director of the Fondazione Federico Zeri, Marciari-Alexander, the president of the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and Matti, Watton, the senior archivist at the V&A. We are going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes. There will be questions at the end, so I hope that you will all be thinking furiously of the hardest thing to ask the panel. What you will probably see is that I'll bring the talk to a close, and then we'll move into questions, if that's okay. Thank you all so much for being here. I think a good place to start, because I think at such an international fair, not everybody will know everything about what you represent, is if you could just tell us a little bit about the archives you work at and what you do there. Shall we start with you?
Andrea starts. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ed. And I do work in Bologna, where we have this foundation. This foundation comes from Federico Zeri legacy. Federico Zeri has been one of the most important art historian and connoisseur of 20th century Italy. He was born in 21 and died in 98. And he left to Bologna University's photo archive and his library. And after that, the University of Bologna decided to create this foundation where we have more or less 300,000 photographs given by him, black and white paper photographs, mainly of Italian paintings, but we have Italian sculpture, we have also Flemish painting, we have archaeology, we have many different decorative art, we have many subjects. And the library with almost 40,000 auction catalogs. And what we decided to do at the beginning of this century was what to do with things, because till that moment, when you received an archival like this, mostly for photo, you just take the photo and put them on paper and put them in boxes, and that was all. And at that moment, we decided instead that it was better to try to digitize them and to put, not only to digitize, but to study, to put them online. And so at the moment, this is maybe one of the largest repository for Italian paintings, photographs. We have already, I think, about 200,000 are there. And also in these years, we got many more different archives which we received, and maybe later we'll speak also about them.
Julia.
Okay, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you to Simone and Grace for helping make this easy. I am the president of the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation is my new employer, and so I can give you a potted précis about what it is, but it is not an archive. It is a foundation that supports the access to and study of pre-modern European art. So in other words, antiquity to about 1830 in the Western European tradition. And we do that through the support, the monetary support of many things. Training of art historians, scholarly publications, museum exhibitions, access to and the building of collections. Samuel H. Kress was in America what we call a five and dime king. He earned his money through creating a series of what were like early precursors of Walmart or any accessible stores for people of modest means to buy anything that they wanted. He did this primarily in the south, southeast, and west of the United States. And in 1935, when he spoke to the young board of trustees of the foundation that he had created in his name, he said that he wanted to give back to those people who made his tremendous wealth possible. And he did that by giving hundreds, thousands of works of art, primarily Italian Renaissance and Baroque, to cities and museums across America. So the National Gallery of Art, almost a third of what they have now, but really at the time, half of what they opened with in 1939 was given to them by Samuel Kress. So it really is about access to art for all in many ways, from the deepest scholarly to the first-time encounter with a real work of art. And we support a lot of digitization.
Yes.
And Samuel Kress and Federico Zeri were actually friends. So
Yes, war.
there are connections.
And Matti.
Yes, so I manage the archives of the Victoria and Albert Museum, normally known as the V&A, a museum dedicated to creativity and with a focus on design and applied arts. So the collections that I manage divide into sort of rough sections. So there's the institutional archive, so the archives of the staff and departments, which tell us about all the museum's activities over time, and they stretch back to the sort of early mid-19th century. As some as you will be aware, the V&A can trace its origins to the mid-19th century, and in particular the South Kensington Museum, which was founded in 1857, and our institutional archive very much covers that period. But we take in collections from external sources as well. So we're the home of the Archive of Art and Design, which is papers of UK-based designers and design companies. We're probably the UK centre for archives of theatre and performance, and we also have some archives relating to childhood and learning because of the museum's management of the Museum of Childhood, now known as Young V&A. And I head up a team which is responsible for, I think, all the things you would expect an archive service to do. So collecting and enhancing the archive, ensuring it's preserved effectively. Traditionally that's been paper, photographs, but now, of course, increasingly born digital material. We're responsible for cataloguing it, digitising what we can, and also providing access services, whether that's on-site or online. We're reasonably heavily used both by people working within the museum, but also very much the general public.
So without wanting to get too geeky about this, I recognise archives are prone to that. Is this a good moment actually just to define what we mean by an archive? Because in one sense, anything in an archive is archival material. In another sense, particularly with museums attached, there could be objects that seem much more suited to a museum collection rather than an archive. So how does that work?
Yes, I mean, there is a danger of becoming geeky in this. I think there's we shouldn't get too obsessed by definitions, but inevitably they matter to a certain degree. So within archive and record keeping communities, we tend to think of archives as records or other information which are kept permanently for their research or evidential value, and because they're evidence of an activity, whether it's an individual or an organisation. So yes, they have research value, but a really important part is the evidence. They tell us what happened. They tell us what people were doing, what they were saying, and so on. We're less inclined to think of archives as the product of a creative process. So our museum collections, whether that's art or object sculpture, which are the end product, which is the product of a creative process, we tend not to think of as an archive within the museum. Now, the moment you put those definitions in place, you start to find grey areas and merging between the two. So I'll sort of get in first on that, if I may. So an example might be a photograph, which clearly could be the product of a creative process, but also it could be within a file or even indeed separate as evidence of something which was happening or an activity which was going on. And there are other types of sort of grey area as well. For example, a design could be a work of art, or it could be just a lead up to some sort of finalised creative output. So that's a go at defining them. I mean, I don't think that to users, to people engaging with archive collections, that really matters as much as it might do to the professionals behind them. And I think that should affect how we work with all those sorts of collections in terms of accessing them.
So you bring up access. Something I'd actually like to ask all of you is how do you see the role of the archive? Is it the preservation of that material? Is it the dissemination of that material? How does the archive interact with a public sphere? Because presumably the material is only as valuable as the strands of thought it's informing, unless I'm wrong.
Both of these aims. I mean, we have many photographs. Our archive, we have a library, but that's not really an archive, but we have what we call now a photo archive. We have also papers, mostly ours is a photo archive. And of course, what we decided to do is to digitize them, to put them online, but doing some entries which were very complicated in a way to do, but very useful to use. And also thinking, I mean, we were, our money mostly was public money. So an instrument which should be used by many people, girls and boys at school, people who like the history of their town, and then collectors, art historians, curators, and all that. And so, for example, we have a double entry for our objects because the photo, as you were saying, is a creative work. So we have an entry where the photo is the object and the author in that case is, for us Italian, Alinari, who has been a great photographer. And then we have an entry for the works of art. And where the author is Raphael, Giotto, Antonio Canova. And also we work a lot in what was unwritten behind the photos, mostly, and I think that can interest public who is here, the history of the provenance of this work. Provenance, late 19th century, early 20th century. And I think that a lot came to Zeri, who did write in a sort of obsessive way, from his experience in the States, from his experience in the Kress, because I think he was working at the Kress when it was decided to disseminate all over America. And so, but to keep everything in mind, I think Zeri was really a person who did use his brain in a way which was a sort of computer, very organized. He did, for example, this book, very crazy, in 1702, which was the census of Italian paintings in North American collection. It's no illustration, it's just written, and there you can find works of art looking through authors, through subjects, and through whereabouts. So it was already thought in the 70s as something which afterwards would have been done by a database. So he liked very much these kind of things. And we try to offer this thing to a general public. And so we are trying to disseminate, to make history and history of art through black and white photos, because we have black and white photos, quite accessible and quite appealing to a different audience, which we try, and also, as you do, we have also lectures, conference, all this kind of thing to involve people from more academic to people in town. We have programs about churches in Bologna, as we are in Bologna, studying and visiting. But it's important we understand that the evidence of the photographs and the evidence the photograph tells about the work of art and his history. All these art historians, they love to have many photos of one object. So you can have a photographic history of the objects. That was quite a crazy story. And when Metropolitan Museum bought a painting which was attributed to Duccio di Boninsegna, at that point, there was an important colleague, who was James Beck, who pretended the painting was a fake. And at that point, some of the curators at the Met, who were quite friends of us, one is Kit Christiansen, they asked, did you have by chance any old photos of this painting? And we did found a second half of the 19th century photos, which was done 1860-70, which was done in a moment where there was not a taste for Duccio and that kind of painting, a taste which came out with Bernard Benson. And so in a way, it was not an evidence, but it helped a lot. And it was a very nasty, ugly photo because it was small like this, but it was quite important. And all these art historians understood how important to have a sort of photographic history of an object.
Yes.
Also,
so the provenance. I mean, it's
the provenance, the conservation. Object changes a lot, no?
Exactly.
And so that's quite important. So this is conservation, but also a dissemination. We try to do at a different level. At least we try.
Yes. Julia, do you want to talk since the Kress came up? Do you
Sure.
want to...
And actually, I think that it might be useful to go to the slides, my two slides.
I'm at your beck and
3,
call.
2. Yes, please. Thank you. I think what's maybe the next one, actually. Yeah, okay. So this is where these are the places across the United States. I'm not going to get into what color, the color coding, and I hope some of you can read that. But these are the places where Kress either gave paintings that the Kress Foundation had purchased from a number of different people, but certain dealers in particular, and of works that had been authenticated or worked on by people like Zeri, who also, by the way, did the only collection catalog of the Italian paintings at the Walters Art Museum, which is where I was before. So I think it's really interesting to see where these objects are. And those are just the works of art. The collections that tell you, the archives that tell you about those places are in many, many places, among them the Fondazione Zeri. So we have been interested in many different ways of thinking about archives, but archives are all objects in and of themselves. So I like to think of this problem that we're talking about today, the complexity of the problem, in that archives are never one thing, and they are different things to each scholar. And one of the really important moments that we are encountering in this day and age, could I have the next slide, is understanding that opening up all of the objects that relate to, say, a painting or a collection actually helps us make connections in different ways with that collection. So what's interesting to me is not the same as what is interesting to Andrea or to Matti, but we have the tools to interest multiple different peoples, which ultimately in their work, whether it's just a visit to a museum or a long, deep, some would consider boring article about something, you have the whole panoply in there. And what I'm showing you on the bottom is a digitized, well, this is the actual object, but the Kress Foundation paid for a substantial amount of the digitization of collections pertaining to the history of collections in America, and gave that money to the Archives of American Art, which is kind of a misnomer because it's actually the Archives of Art in America, if you will. And what these papers in this blue file are the monuments typescript. So what the monuments men typed up when they were cataloging the contents of Hermann Goering's collection. So it was post-war, and it wasn't Hermann Goering's list of his collection. It's Hermann Goering's collection as seen through the eyes of those monuments men who are collecting it and preserving the documentation of it. And this object is interesting, not just about what was in the collection, but how the monuments men themselves decided they were encountering it. So what is number one? What is number two? And then you have this object, which is a typescript. All of a sudden there are these notes alongside it. The fronts and the backs of the pages are photographed, and it's all online. So how we think of these objects as archives are also archives of the moments of encounter with works of art. So that was complicated, but I think it's really important that to look at Matti's comment, we need to kind of certify, and you're an archivist and I'm a museum historian, we need to stop doing that. We need to think about why am I coming at this object, and then think about it not as an archive, but a work of art in and of itself, or a moment of study. And access isn't for me to determine, it's for me to provide. Right? So I'm not supposed to tell you what you're going to think about it, but it's my job to make it open and possible for you.
Which is delightful, but
Ooh, I love that.
I'm thrilled to be able to make up my own mind, but there is a very real problem, isn't there, of resource and making these archives open to people.
Yes.
So how do we...
And philosophies of whether or not that's even correct.
The right thing to do. So I'm afraid, Matti, I'm coming to you.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think I would agree with you there, Julia, in terms of the fact that to those there are communities or individuals who are engaging with our material, whether that's museum collections or archives, it shouldn't really matter too much what that is behind the scenes. It's just something that they would find interesting and will aid them in whatever their research or interest happens to be. I think that's very true. The challenges aren't the sort of principal ones, they're the practicalities. Right. Because archives are uneven in themselves. In order to be able to understand a research topic in depth, the likelihood is that you're going to be looking for archives which are not necessarily stored in the same place, housed by the same institution, accessed in the same way. And even if they are, are, it might well not be within the same records series or group of records. There's going to be quite a lot of detective work that you need to do. And that's the type of barrier we, of course, try to break down in terms of our cataloguing and our signposting of collections held elsewhere. But there will always be that challenge, I think, within archives themselves before you then get on to what museum collections are going to be useful as well. And I think it's part of our role to try and see where those challenges are and to work on them, but not get bogged down in too much of the conceptual stuff, really.
One of the things that I think was influential for me as a scholar was the serendipity of discovery. And I wonder how digitization actually helps with that or hinders that. You go into a library and you look and you see, this is the book that I came to find, but this one is actually more interesting. Or I'm looking at this particular folder, what's in the next folder? And then that's that rabbit hole that you go down, and there's so much controlled in the digital archive that you have to know how to search for it.
Well, also there's another point as well, isn't there, around digitization? Obviously, digitization for all of the institutions where you work is a very valuable tool in widening access to the archives.
Yes, as she was saying. Oh, sorry.
But,
No, I was thinking, she was saying we have to give access, and I think that's the key. But what I was thinking is that it's not a neutral operation. You always make a decision which kind of access you give and which paths of research you want to make going on, and this depends on our institution to decide what to see, at least if you want just to show a photograph of a list, or if you want to make a research through the names, and so make a different kind of research. And I think this is up to us, and this is a little bit of a challenge today, because people are not so interested in the past and how to make them interested in the past. And for example, being here, I'm thinking that we try to do a lot of work on the art market, because we have many writing things, handwriting about the history of a market. And so we're starting with a dictionary of dealers. But that's a decision, and that's a decision to give access to something which you don't find generally in a library. In a library, you find books about artists, about collectors, not so many. If you are Duvin, maybe, but for the others, not. For Contini Bonacossi, we both know very well, you don't have so much. And so to make some new paths of research about the history of the market for us is important.
But there's also a sort of, what I think I'm going to call the box set problem, which is digitization is a relatively recent process.
Yes.
And it takes time. Even if you have all the money in the world, it takes time
and money.
So if people are relying on the digitized version of the archive, there are going to be lacunae, holes, within that archive. So drawing the connections that you might, if you're in the physical space, just come through coincidence. The act of digitization is already controlling how the information is dispersed. So is that...
And it's in reaction to what we're asked for often.
Yeah.
So it sort of like the Michelangelo problem. Like, does there need to be another exhibition on Michelangelo? Well, yes, because people will come. So it's a circular, it's a circular thing. So I'm going to do my dissertation on Michelangelo because there's always a demand about Michelangelo. So then all of that is digitized first, when in fact, what's really interesting are all the artists just below Michelangelo who are forgotten about, who are interesting, who had huge impact. A lot of the women artists. But until somebody asks for women, information on women artists, we don't look at them. We don't provide the documentation. We don't put the resources into making that available, even though it's there.
Yes. Matti, you were nodding wildly.
I nodded. There is a risk of less chance of serendipity, but I think I'm optimistic about this in the sense that...
Oh my God.
Well, if that's allowed.
So good.
We're never going to digitise everything. There are always going to be collections which have to be consulted in person. There are always, I'm afraid, going to be collections that people haven't studied very much. So I think the chances of serendipity are still there. They're just going to hopefully take a different form. I don't think it's an excuse not to do digitisation projects. It's just, I think, a warning to be mindful of the fact that there's still going to be a lot of stuff which isn't out there online, and we mustn't forget that.
And I think we might have fallen foul of talking about archives being used by researchers while also nodding towards public access. And they're quite different things, aren't they? Because obviously researchers and academics are coming to the archives with specific questions in mind to look for certain projects, books, whatever it is. If we're worried, as you say, of people not having a love of the past or a knowledge of the past, how do these incredible resources that capture the material of the past get opened up to the public in a way that the public can understand them?
You have to work on it, and with now all the DH people, digital humanities people, to find new, not just that you ask for all the paintings by Michelangelo, but find maps, where did Michelangelo work, where are works by Michelangelo working together, who did study Michelangelo in the past, and doing all these things very evident, also visually evident, and this help people, also not people who are not academic, to get involved, to get interested in this. You have to balance the two kind, the academic one, but also the other one to, let's say, to collectors, to people who are interested in Michelangelo, who may discover new paths, who have been the collectors who did collect Michelangelo in the past, who are the dealers, or which are the question about the restoration of Michelangelo work, because I think you have a lot of also on restoration about the paintings, no? So, and to try to make this thing, and I think that now we have a generation of young people who works in the digital humanities, and they are humanists first. And so they know how to handle with history and which are the possible paths to discover new interesting way to attract people interested in this. And as you say, also human artists, artists who came from peripheral places. So also to mix up things and to make new voices in this. I mean, from the time Kress collected and Zeri studied, things have changed a lot, but we have to try to keep the things they were interested alive in our world in a new way and discover new unexpected paths maybe. And through the archives you can try to do it, maybe working with young people who have different interests from mine, for example.
Yes.
I think that the exciting thing, people like to have experiences. We were talking about what's the best exhibition you've seen, and at the table we all realized that the reasons we liked those exhibitions were that we had some kind of visceral, physical experience in the space of objects, of the way other people are experiencing the objects, a moment of wonder, you just have no idea. And I think that where we have come to realize that digital isn't the end of the physical, right? People don't go to museums now because they can get everything online, but they want to have a different kind of experience with it. So trying to get people to come to places like TEFAF, where you actually have you have access to incredible art that you will never see together in the same way as you do this week. It just won't happen. This group of works of art will never be together in the same way. So just by being here, you have access to the physicality of the objects. The archive of this event will be interesting for some other people, this video. And it's
going to be blockbuster.
I know.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So how do we share those opportunities so that people get interested, hooked in by whatever it is, that moment, what is their way in? It's providing multiple venues for having that way in.
Yes. So, sorry.
Well, I was just picking up on that. We mustn't lose that sense of wonder in an increasingly digital environment. There still is a sense of people being captivated by the opportunity to engage with something physical, whether it's because of its age or because of its significance. And obviously, we run sort of open days where I see that, for the public looking at things and really getting that sense of wonder. And we still need to try and fulfil that need of people to see that. And we want to break down barriers as well. I mean, we firmly believe that the archives aren't just for people who have a scholarly interest. We think that we would, everybody would learn something from archives, whether it's about their family, their locality, the things that they're interested in. The likelihood is that the people would engage with those collections in a different way. from the scholar. It's likely to be through the type of events I've talked about, and that's fine. And it'll be through our displays, including archive material and so on. From our perspective, we're also mindful of the fact that a big proportion of our usage is by people coming from scholarly backgrounds, and the way we do that, for example, is probably some of the collections that we might prioritise sort of cataloguing or digitising in detail might well be those where we know there's been research in the past. So, but I firmly believe we can cater to both of those audiences. They're not mutually exclusive.
Which is reassuring. And Julia came up with this excellent line that digital isn't the end of the physical, but the world that we are living in is increasingly relying on digital. Yeah. So does that mean the archives of the archives of the present in the future are going to be increasingly digital? So how does that raise a problem for archives? How do we capture that? How do we set people up to be able to unlock this present when it's the past?
Yes, it is going to be more digital in the future, absolutely, because so looking at some of these institutional records you can see here, a lot of the equivalents as they're being created now are digital rather than the paper that was created however many decades ago. And that means that is a challenge for us as an organisation to be putting in place the relevant policies, procedures and technical solutions to enable that material to be preserved and access to be provided in the future. And that is something we and many organisations are working on, but the outcomes of that are not necessarily easy to predict. But that is the way the future will probably look, and we need to be ready for that.
Is it going to result in a slight flattening of what's recorded? Andrea talks about the art market leaders, the dealers, the collectors. Everybody knows that they wrote notes to each other. Frick cabled his dealers in a fury when he lost out on a painting, which gives character and life to everybody, especially when they were in all caps. Are we able to capture emails between people? Is that going to be something that we would find in an archive?
I don't know if we want.
Correct. Texts.
Also, whether the archive wants or whether the people want?
Both. No, but I think that that's a challenge also for, we are more or less, I can say, public archives, to give a direction where to go, a direction of reliability, and to be properly scholar. This depends on us because you find everything on the net, but you have to look at some precise institution like ours in different fields to get digital material, but which are material which have been worked. Because it's not just to digitize, but it's also to study and digitize. Right. You have to do both things together. And at that point, what you find on the internet can be useful, can be used, and can be important. And I think that's a little bit the challenge of institutions different as the others in this moment, to understand what to digitize, in which way, and what you expect people to find, and what, on the other side, people has to see really in, not in digital, but to see the real objects. But there are many things still which can be digitized, but you have to have, let's say, a policy, I don't know if it's the right word, but more or less this. And I think that our institutions, and institutions like ours, there are many, have to decide what to do, no? To think what to do and
how to pay for doing that. I think
I'm telling you.
A big issue that I had an example is at the Walters and before that. You know, most museums have very slim margins and resources. So there are sort of operational costs, and then there are what I ungenerously call eat what you kill projects, right? Yeah. So, which are the over and above your operational costs. And digitization has always and still remains kind of an eat what you kill project. In that, we think we're going to be able to get funding for this, so we don't have to build into our staffing, our operational costs, our annual costs, any of this money, because we're going to be able to get funding for it. Well, that funding isn't going to be there forever, and actually that is now the work. So how do you, art history isn't, this kind of art history and then a digitization project. Art history is about those archives, the photo archives, those archives, and that's how you do art history. So if we in museums or archives want to continue to think about the usefulness and the accessibility of our fototeca, our photo archives, that can't be a project that is solely possible by annually maintained individual asks of funders. That will go away.
No.
So, 20 years of funding isn't guaranteed. You need to think about what am I not going to do anymore, and if your budget isn't going to grow, in order to facilitate this new work of our field. And I think that that's a really important shift that we have to make. Digitization isn't a new fun thing. It is the work.
Yeah, it's been around for a while now.
Correct.
And it's not going anywhere.
Correct. And ever more, it's making the field more interesting.
Yes.
Because you don't have to have access to this glass solely to do something interesting with this glass. You can, read about Federico Zeri's correspondence, but not the correspondence of the person he wrote to about this glass.
Yeah.
So, yeah. That's my bugaboo, sorry.
Flipping back, frankly. There we go.
I mean, there's two areas there, but linked by the question of resources, actually. So to come to the first point about email and digital records, one of the big challenges of them is there are more of them.
Yes.
So if you compare the number of emails sent compared with the number of letters written about the same operation in the pre-digital era, there will be far more content now and there will be more complexity in terms of the relationships between them. But I suspect the amount of resources to deal with that year on year is probably going, without prejudging our budget for next year, is probably going to be similar. Or less, indeed. So what we're going to have to do is adapt some of our archival practice to accommodate that. And what it will probably mean is not being able to assess what has been created quite as rigorously as we used to in the past. So that means some things, because we don't keep everything, so some of the things which don't survive are things which might have survived in the future, in the past, because we had more resource to assess them. And sometimes things will be catalogued in less detail because we have to spread our resources more thinly. I mean, email is a very quite specific challenge, but all that applies to it. I can see scenarios where organisations will have to make very big judgments about email. Certain staff's email is important, others it is not, because it simply won't be possible to micro-manage that. And yes, that could mean that the marginal notes from a century ago, the equivalent of those, don't survive. That is a possibility.
And is there a problem about consent? I mean, the nice thing about people who wrote letters and are dead is that they have literally no ability to complain, whereas it requires a bit of active engagement to capture the email before it goes into the digital ether.
Yes, I mean, consent within our institutional records tends to be
automatic.
Tends to be automatic, yes. What was the other point you mentioned?
It is just about that's it. That is the point.
Okay.
Do people need to actively consent, given that if they don't consent, the window for capturing their email disappears?
Sorry, yes.
I think they did exercise a form of consent. We were speaking earlier about one of the Contini Bonacorsi who did not. He wrote letters, but we don't have the responses. So perhaps he didn't want those responses read, so they're destroyed. So destroy your email if you don't want, but it still lives on. That's the other thing, and it's also really expensive. I mean, and the cost to the environment of all this digitization I'm sorry to get not only geeky, but really depressing.
It's perfect. We're coming to the end of time of this talk.
Coming
We
to the
might
end
as
of
well
time.
mimetically represent that. This is joyful. But actually, that's a really important point. Full disclosure, we met a little earlier and we're getting very overexcited about this subject. One of the first things we spoke about was the environmental cost, because obviously when digitization projects began, people thought this was incredible. It doesn't take up space. It doesn't take up that much resource. It's the way of searching it is instantaneous. Now people are much more conscious of the enormous cooling factories in the middle of America to keep the servers working, to hold this stuff. How does that play into the work you do?
I think it plays a great role, as money does. Yeah. And I think that now one of the things that we are going to do, most of us, is to collaborate. As you know, there is, for example, this Pharos project, which will try to put together some of the more important photo archive about European art, both in Europe, in Italy, in United Kingdom, in Germany, in France, and in the States, the Frick, Getty, and to try to make our digitization project going together. And there is a trying, we got, I think, a Kress grant.
Thank you to the people before me.
Yeah, so we hope now more, because it's not easy to put things together. If you have the same painting, but with different photos, or with different ideas, one in a photo archive in Bologna, the other one in Florence, the other one in Marburg, another one in Den Haag, and the other one in Washington, to make just one entry with all the information, and this we are trained trying to work on it, because this would make things also maybe more rational, also from an economical point of view, and also all this problem about storage of this data, which becomes more and more problematic, also from an environmental, I don't say it properly, sorry, point of view.
I think you said that was a mess, though, because it's a great idea, but it ultimately is a mess. Because the object that you're photoing, that you have the photo of, that is a unique object. Even maybe the photograph is the same photograph by Alinari. But all of the commentary around it, the one on the Getty, the one on the Hertziana, it's different. So how then do you, without the resources to figure out how to get all that data into one document, you ultimately still need the 10.
Yeah.
So you can't dedupe that, because they're 10 different separate artifacts, even though the object is one artifact.
Yes.
Kind of a mess.
You can try.
Yeah. I can't work out whether the professional archivist at the end of the sofa is desperate to leap in on.
No, wasn't desperate to leap. But the point about sustainability is a really important one. I think there has been a certain casualness in terms of thinking of digital storage as we know it's not free, but I don't think we've had a full understanding of the costs involved in doing that. And so we are, for example, going to have to look at how our record-keeping processes work within the organisation, with a view to understanding that better. And also across the organisation, now moving from a mindset of thinking that our records are stored in particular physical spaces, and that's how we manage that, to thinking that our collections are stored digitally, and we have to manage that effectively. And we're that's a journey, really. But I think as sort of environmental concern grows in some quarters, that's something we'll definitely do.
Can I just go back to the big issue? I mean, we're all talking about archives, and we're all talking about how do we keep these objects relevant and interesting? And I think ultimately, isn't this about the creativity and the interactivity of humans across time? And isn't that the purpose of this? It's not just to keep the records of a photograph that was made, of a sculpture that was made in a moment, right? It's not about necessarily the work of art that is depicted. It's about how all of us continue in different ways to get excited and have an experience and have a personal moment with something that was made 500, 800, 10, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And we lose sight of the people in the art with looking at just the person in the art. And so I think it's really a wonderful way. Archives connect people through the art, through the objects, through the paper, through the way that that blue paper, that archivist, somebody put Hermann Goering's typeset into that. You just think about who's touched this, and it's all about that kind of sense of touch across time. I think that's what excites me about doing this work, and it's not. It is about getting someone excited at the highest level and at the deepest level, all at the same time.
I think that might be the perfect place for me to say thank you very much for joining me at TEFAF. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Matti. Thank you. And we will now have time for questions, which I hope is all right. So I think there is a microphone. Simone has a microphone. This is excellent. Does anyone have a question? No. Oh, yes, excellent.
You.
I'll start. I'm a layman, so I'm not working in this field. But I'm also a collector, and I'm retired, and I enjoy the arts already for a long, long time.
Yay.
And now I have more time. I started researching on objects. And I think many collectors have a lot of information. And so, by accident, I met a person from V&A here at the TEFAF 2 years ago. And I could, because she introduced me, I was emailed and I could give the information and they were happy. They would just put it in the file. So that was one, but it was just by accident. If I would try it by the internet, look for a person for a certain department, that was not possible. And I also think it's difficult because there might be a lot of questions. All the people working at the museum are short in time and in funds, and they don't know whether it's serious or not. So I go to the Belgian authorities. I try to find information in the archives. I didn't know where to go to. I will cut to my question. But I have to explain this because this is my experience. And it was just because of a scientific researcher who had just had his PhD that I got a name, and he gave me very willingly the correct email address. Then I could get into the archive. I had to bring my passport and everything. And then I got this number. And ever since I am a number, it's much easier to get information from archives in Belgium. Belgium is very willing in helping people to give information once you get a little bit in the system of the archives. The Netherlands is terrible. So this Belgian journalist I spoke, Mr. Sels, he said, he had a wonderful book on, how do you say it, stolen arts, in short. And whenever he tried in the Netherlands to get information, the museum would just not work. And I have the same, they say, okay, well, the person is not here, and then you try to get the person, and the person is not there. So it's all in their heads, and it's not accessible. And then often you try to get it by all kinds of different means in Germany, and then it's private information. And then once again, you're blocked. And I don't need the names, I just want the information on the provenance, for instance, of certain objects. And meanwhile, of course, also the art history. But it's because you love the art itself that you are getting curious. How did it go? How was? So my question is, because I already spent 2 years trying to get some information, and I did find a lot. And then it was so much that I needed an art historian to help me figure it out. Is there nowadays that you know of, or maybe in college, people who are trained to look into all kinds of archives, especially when they're all differently built up? And I'm an academic, but really I find it very difficult to find my way in archives. So are there institutions or companies or persons you can hire who can do all this kind of work for you?
There we go. Do we have a flock of freelance archivists?
There are people who work in that field, yes. The last time I looked on the website of the UK's National Archives, there was a list of people offering those services. So they do exist, whether there's individuals or small groups. From a perspective of the V&A, we answer all the inquiries that we are sent. Often the challenge around that is finding the information rather than wanting to engage with inquirers. Archives can be complex, they can be uneven, they can be in different parts of the museum and so on. But we certainly don't want to hide, we don't want to put up barriers in the face of people wanting information. But the short answer in terms of are there people who work in the field of doing that type of research? Yes, there are.
Are they screened by these trusts? Because sometimes it regards sensitive information. And how do you know you can trust these people with the information you have and to hit each other with ideas?
That's a very good question. I don't believe it's a regulated
There's no
profession.
professional body.
Now, you're stretching the limits of my knowledge here. There is for genealogy researchers, though there is a body which accredits those, which is, I think, the Association of Genealogists and Researchers in Archives. So there are for those, but I suspect there are people who are offering to do this work who won't be regulated in that way. And so, yes, I appreciate there are risks there if you haven't built up the necessary trust.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else?
I think that is an issue, what you said about the difficulty, but it's also the barrier of self-doubt. I mean, I've been a museum professional for over 40 years now. And when I was 20 or 18 even, when I was just starting out, I feel the same way when I go to the Bibliothèque Nationale, for instance. That is really scary, and it makes you feel like you're unworthy, and it makes it really challenging. And then you have to ask questions that aren't straight questions. So we do a really good job as institutions in general, unlike yours, of making people feel unwelcome because it makes our jobs easier. I mean, ultimately, that's, I think, the way it is, or, that's the traditional thing. I think one of the beauties of today is that more and more people are interested in institutions are interested in making that first encounter welcoming as opposed to off-putting. And I hope that in 10 years, you feel like you've actually not only broken through the wall, but actually helped to break that wall.
Well, I think, oh yes.
I'm curious about this issue of the moment of discovery of adjacent things when you were next to the book that you were actually looking for. Mm-hmm. I know nothing about how your archives are organized. But I presume there's more to a record than just the artist's name.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's region, it's style, it's other similar and so forth. And I wonder the extent to which you make the taxonomy around that accessible so that people in investigating one particular artist can see others like that or others that fit this theme or that theme, and to go from geeky to massively over-trivializing. It's essentially what music apps do. Mm-hmm. If you like this artist, you'll probably like this one and this one, and they put together a playlist with an algorithm.
Or shopping apps, yes.
That's a very, very good point. So there is more to it than that, yes. So, for example, our archival records will historically, so moving before the digital environment, they will generally be files created by particular parts of the museum, and they will potentially relate to more than one avenue of potential research. So to take a simple example, a file on a particular acquisition is obviously interesting from the perspective of that item, but it's also interested in terms of the donor and the organizational policy and all the other types of things. And what we try and do is when we catalogue that item to reflect as much of that as we can, But do we have the resources to do that in a way which will cover all potential future avenues of research? No, we don't. And as we have more material to work through, because we will always have a cataloguing backlog, that will become more challenging, and therefore there is more likelihood of researchers needing to navigate their way through those collections themselves, facilitated by us as much as we can. And that will then potentially give rise to the sort of serendipity we were talking about earlier. It is always a question of balancing available resources with the tasks in hand. So do we work on material in depth, or do we do it in slightly less depth but work on more material? We face those decisions not every day, but certainly as part of our planning. There's no right answer, but that's what we have to do.
And some archives are actually opening themselves up to what is not really crowdsourcing, but kind of crowdsourcing, so that if I come to that archive and that object, I then add my own. It's sort of like Wikipedia, right? You add your own. Not many are doing this, but I think it
is the potential future. Yes. So I don't think the archive community has cracked this yet, but there are some high-profile examples of those sorts of crowdsourcing projects which have exponentially increased the usefulness of the resources which have been worked on. Now, not every collection lends itself to that type of project. I mean, broadly speaking, something where you are listing particular names or particular values, or numbers, then that lends itself very well to crowdsourcing. Actually analysing what the significant contents of a file, less suited to that. Does it need to be checked? If it's going to be checked, that person might as well have done it in the first place. There's those sorts of issues. But I'm surprised we've got this far without mentioning AI, which is pretty unusual. Most of the things that
I was trying very hard not to. I feel like all I've spoken about this weekend has been AI.
No, fair enough. So I'll only mention it briefly in that we haven't cracked this yet either. But I can imagine a scenario where once they develop to be effective enough, we might move into a scenario where those sorts of tools are able to provide some of the metadata that we've been talking about, not having the resources for. Do some of the selection of records that I've talked about that we might not have the resources for. But nobody has mastered that as far as I'm aware, and so I'll leave it there.
Oh, and one more. Oh, lots of thousands. Here we go.
Hello, my name is Sophie van Doormaal. I work at the Rijksmuseum, and I'm kind of triggered by, we just launched a platform in November, our collection online, and actually it touches upon AI, and now we have our archives and also all object imagery searchable online, and I find it does actually exactly what you were saying. When you're researching, you find things that are adjacent. And like you were saying, like, oh, maybe you like this artist, or you're looking for a picture of a dog. And then you find everything in the collection that resembles dogs. So I think the first steps are being made in kind of the field. And I'm very curious to hear about the panel, if what they think that would look like for the future.
Wonderful and scary all at the same time. If I think about what's cataloged as babies on my iPhone and what comes up, wonderful and scary.
I think we have time probably for one more question, and there is a woman over there who...
Thank you very much. Very interesting panel. I love archives. No problems going there. But since we're at TEFAF, and I know that some galleries close every once in a while, is there an archive of TEFAF Fair? And are you keeping track of who's been here before and anything else that we can maybe...
I love that you're looking at me. I wish I were representative of TEFAF enough to be able to say...
But what do you think?
Yes. I believe TEFAF... There are certainly the TEFAF catalogues, and they obviously keep a list of all of their exhibitors. The deals that happen, the movement of art, is down to the galleries themselves. So what you really need to do is get all their ledgers together. But to say that you need to get gallery ledgers together is like saying, I want all your family secrets, and I want the access codes to your bank, and if you have the nuclear code, that would be great. So it's very complicated. I mean, I think there's also... What you're really talking about is archiving the art market in some way, which is to me an utterly fascinating topic. You are both welcome to join in at any stage with this answer, but I think it's also fascinatingly hard to do. What's really interesting is we've had a couple of very high-profile closures of art galleries recently, not least Marlborough. Not that I want to rub salt in their wounds, but what's quite clearly the most valuable aspect of that closure is the ledger. Yeah. And while the inventory is being sold through auction, it's the ledger that people are fighting over and are willing to go to battle over, including a couple of prospective cases. But how that material is then made public, sadly, remains with the private individuals who are responsible for it. I think that the immediate argument or the immediate engagement with this is what art market journalists do. And art market journalists are the scourge of many galleries, and most galleries don't want to disclose the value because they don't want to impact the future ongoing costs or sales of their work. And they also don't want to reveal the names of their collectors who wish to remain private. All of that is totally understandable. But there's going to come a moment, we were actually talking about history of collecting at lunch, where this information will come out. How it comes out with the digital paraphernalia that we have slightly remains to be seen. But I think it's a space that's really fascinating and worth watching.
And I think that the issue of price is sale price is always going to be difficult, because even people who have been long gone, they did not want people to know how much they paid for something. And so they worked with the dealer to kind of make sure that it wasn't findable. And that's human nature. You don't want that to get out there. Many people don't want that to get out there. So even as those records become available, really digging in and finding it. But I will say that TEFAF, as an organization, is committed to making these programs online and available. And over the last 5, 6, 7 years, there's been much more of a record of the fair. Yes, it's a curated record, but it's still a record that was not available earlier on. So I hope that continues and that it continues to open up even more. Thank you.
Well, once again, may I thank our panelists, Andrea, Julia, and Matti, for, I think, what has been a great conversation. I hope you all agree. And so I think all that is left to say is thank you very much and go and enjoy the rest of the fair.
Thank you.